Lebanon's parliament fails to elect a president. It's not the first time, but with the country facing one of the worst economic crises on the planet, can the Lebanese afford more political instability and a deadlocked government? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Lebanon. Well, for years, Lebanon's government has been under inordinate pressure to reform. Massive street protests have demanded an end to a political system they believe is too poisoned by corruption and sectarianism to serve its people. And proof of that has come in many forms. In one case, the massive Beirut port explosion. In another, a financial implosion that's plunged 3/4 of Lebanon's population into poverty. The government has sat deadlocked, barely able to function, much less push through meaningful reform. And today, Parliament was supposed to elect a new president to replace Michel Aoun. Needless to say, that didn't happen. Here's Jack Sahora with more.
Many were surprised that Lebanon's parliament speaker, Nabi Berri, even called a vote to elect a new president. No one heading into the special session had the 2/3 support needed from the country's 128 MPs. The leader of the Marada party, Slimane Frangieh, is an ally to both Hezbollah and Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. He received the backing of some key parties, but not the body's major Christian bloc. And the other three candidates, the granddaughter of a former president, a businessman, and a women's advocate, didn't garner any formal endorsements. When the votes were tallied, it was clear that no one person stood a chance. 63 ballots were left blank. Another 10 simply said Lebanon. While they were symbolic votes, it seems the real loser is Lebanon. The World Bank called the country's economic crisis among the world's worst in 150 years, accusing Beirut's leaders of operating a giant Ponzi scheme.
It has hurt all institutions and pushed the majority of Lebanese below the poverty line and caused the exodus of a lot of promising young potential, and the country has lost its elite.
The plan to turn around Lebanon's fortunes rests on an IMF bailout worth $3 billion, a plan that comes with caveats.
Our government has signed a preliminary agreement with the IMF, and we pledge from this platform that we will proceed with all necessary administrative and legislative reforms in order to end our current plight.
Those reforms include major fiscal changes, including the restructuring of public debt and putting in place strong anti-corruption and anti-money laundering measures. The hope was to get these done by October. However, failing to pick a president and thus failing to establish a government will all but ensure that the goalposts will once again be moved further down the line. It also means the Lebanese people will continue to watch their standard of living decline. Streetlights are no longer lit at night. The lines outside of bakeries and petrol stations grow longer by the day. And people are robbing banks at gunpoint, demanding the money from their own personal accounts. These are all the markers of a failed state, and a failing to heed the advice of UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres, who has repeatedly urged Lebanon's government to put people in front of politics.
Meanwhile, parliamentarian Michel Moawad can claim more votes than any other candidate for president, and though it's nowhere near the 2/3 majority called for, Moawad seems to think he has momentum. So will Lebanon get a president before Michel Aoun leaves office on October 31st? Joining me now to debate that from Beirut is Mark Daou, a member of parliament with the Progress Party, and also in the Lebanese capital is Farid Boustany. He is an MP with President Michel Aoun's Free Patriotic movement. Thanks both so much for being with us. Farid, your president has said he will not hand over powers to a caretaker government. But right now, that is all there is. So, will a president be chosen? And if not, will President Aoun have to change his mind?
No, he will leave on the 31st of October, midnight. he'll go home. That's not negotiable. That's what our Constitution calls for.
I'm not
and
asking if
that's
he will
what
leave or not. I'm
obey by.
asking if he will hand
mean,
over
all
powers
this-
to a caretaker government if a president is not chosen.
He has to. He has to. That's what the Constitution calls for. That there is a government, whether it's a government with a caretaker or not. This government will take over power after the departure of the president.
Okay.
That's a fact.
But he said so clearly that Sunni Prime Minister Najib Mikati's government is just not equipped to take over his role as president.
Okay, that can be interpreted as an encouragement for Mikati to, speed it up and form a proper government. I'll tell you the truth, when we discussed the vote on the budget, when you look at this, the entire government of Mikati, we found that these people really do not deserve to be ministers. Many of them are not capable to carry on such job. So I think there is a very much need for Mikati to get his act together and change some of the ministers and get ready just in case there is a vacancy in the presidential palace.
Okay. Mark, let me turn to you. First of all, do you foresee a president being chosen by Parliament? And if not, will this caretaker government simply have to assume presidential powers? Because as it seems to stand in Lebanon right now, anything is better than nothing.
Unfortunately, I think any government will take the presidential prerogatives, because in any system there is no absolute vacuum. There is a continuation of power, and de facto that is clear. I think in the Constitution it said the prerogatives of the president will return to a government. It did not specify fully functioning government or a caretaker government. So I think there is no real debate there. But I believe from what we've seen today in the session, with the majority of people undecided and voting blanks in the presidential election today, that might hasten the formation of a government as an excuse, given what we've seen today, that there is no president anytime soon. The vacuum is the worst thing to happen to the presidential position, and therefore let's just form a government and agree to it. And I'm afraid that that might be purposely orchestrated to allow for the creation of a government and then lengthen the negotiations around the president and tie it up to other positions as well, such as what's happening with the IMF deal, what will happen to critical positions in government as the terms of those people occupying them, such as the central bank, expire, and then we would have to do a lot of replacements. So I believe this is a grand negotiation happening. The negotiation so far, led by the Prime Minister designate Najib Mikati and his ally, President Nabi Berri, Speaker of the House, I believe those two are pushing towards the formation of a government, and they're negotiating with the FPM and others on its creation, because most of the opposition consider themselves not really concerned on the creation of a government that constitutionally should resign as soon as a new president is elected in the coming 30 days.
Okay. Are you seeing October 31st, though, Mark, as a genuine deadline? Is that when we will see whatever change is supposed to happen? Hopefully it will come in the form of transferring power to a new president. Will it happen on October 31st or November 1st?
I believe with all that we've been hearing, recently there was more than 20 members of the European ambassador delegates to Lebanon. 20 ambassadors were doing a tour on all the presidents and telling them reforms need to happen now. Maintaining the constitution needs to happen now. Everyone is highly concerned about what will happen to Lebanon if we go even into a 1 second or a 1 minute vacuum in the presidency, because there's no stopping it after that. And I think this is a risk no one is willing to take, especially the Lebanese, who have to pay a very heavy price in case of the failure of creating a government or electing a president and not concluding an IMF deal, which is 7 months old so far, the primary agreement, staff level agreement. And if we continue to delay, the numbers will be different, and thus the deal will be obsolete.
Okay. Farid, let me come back to you because, as I said earlier, the Lebanese people themselves have been demanding, not just a new government, but massive reform and an end to the sectarianism that they feel actually paralyzes the government's work and really entrenches corruption. Is that sectarian system, however, entrenched just too deeply to take away at this point? Will the Lebanese just have to accept that this is the government and the style of government they will have to be dealing with for the near future, at least?
Well, what happened today, and I believe my colleague Mark will agree, the system that we have has really fundamental problems. Today, we went to vote for a president of the state, and we didn't know who were the candidates, what their curriculum vitae, what program they have. It was kind of a blind process, and that's not good. In Lebanon, the parliament votes the president. In other countries, such as the US, it's the people vote for the president. So today what happened was just like a kind of an intention session, a scouting to see how coalition can form together to create a breakthrough and vote for a president. We have two basic issues that must be resolved between now and the 31st of October. Number one is to complete the negotiation with the IMF that we desperately need. I mean, I was part of this negotiation for the last 2 years, and I know that they're asking for reforms. The parliament could not deliver these reforms entirely, although we tried hard. The second is the issue negotiating the border, the maritime border with Israel. This has to be done very fast. I don't believe that this parliament and the present government can complete all the other reforms that the IMF is asking for, although we tried. The capital control was one example that on a small issue that has been going on back and forth for the last 2 years, we just could not do it.
Okay.
And I'm going to tell you why we couldn't do it. We couldn't do it because many of the players right now are the ones who really took their money out of the Lebanese banks and put them outside of Lebanon. So do they want a capital control? No. So I guess we have to take it one step at a time. And if I may interject here, I'll say unless we reach a secular state, the system that we're operating under cannot continue and is not good for Lebanon and really has no future.
Right. Mark, I mean, everyone seems to understand what the fundamental problems are, yet we keep ending up with political deadlock. The economic crisis just continues and, in fact, gets worse. Where is this supposed to go now?
I believe we're in a transition phase in Lebanon. There is a political epoch which has basically concluded, and this is why people like myself now are in parliament, or 10% of parliament as change MPs and others. And I think that transition is happening because there's a political system that can no longer run the country. It has caused an economic crisis, a constitutional crisis, as well as an administrative crisis because most of the government functions now are barely operating. And I would like to remind everyone watching that Lebanon has been without electricity for the past 7 months or 8 months. We barely get 1 hour of electricity in a country in 2022. So basically, I think we're at the end of a line and we need to turn a corner and start fresh. And doing that requires that we stop approaching politics the same old way that was done. So far, we have not been very successful because the system is still entrenched, the deep state, the alliances, and the ability of the regime, the establishment, to recreate itself through the rigged elections or what happened now, and I mean here the parliamentary elections, the way the blocks are being built and how voting is being conducted, such as today. We're 30 days away and more than half of parliament does not have a presidential candidate. And I think the reforms that are required by the IMF so far are pretty far from being concluded, even the ones we voted on, such as the bank secrecy law. We received a statement from the IMF basically saying it's subpar, it is not what we expected, and this is a list of changes that we recommend you do, so we consider that law as part of the reforms.
Right. Just quickly, when Michel Moawad sees himself as a viable candidate, though, for president, do you agree?
I think everyone has the right to present themselves. He got nearly 1/3 of parliament today. He's a qualified person, but I believe requiring an election today of someone requires a quorum of 2/3, and I don't think that will come without a political consensus. And I do not think that Mr. Moawad will be capable of achieving that. And I think that is a fact he realizes himself as well.
Okay. Farid, quickly, when you hear people say that Lebanon is in fact a failed state, how do you respond?
It is. Unfortunately, it is. The fact speaks for themselves. We have failed for the last 3 decades of building a proper state for many reasons. We don't have time to go into it, but I'll say, like Mark said, we are in a transition. We're looking forward to have new leaders that will act in a different way. We want a parliament that makes the government accountable. The government is not accountable to anyone. Can you believe it? That they operate the way they want. I mean, why are we having a parliamentary system? Is to make new laws and to make the government, the executive branch, accountable. It's not happening.
Okay.
The presidency, unfortunately, for many decades has not been able to get people together, to become really the judge and assemble people. And now the new president has to play that role to bring all factions, all groups, all people that dream of a new Lebanon into a new concept and try to bring all the people that emigrated in the last 2 decades back to Lebanon and give them hopes and jobs.
Farid Boustany, that will be the final word. I'd like to thank you and Mark Daou really so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Now to West Africa, a region that has seen a series of military coups displacing civilian leaders from Guinea to Burkina Faso and Guinea-Bissau. Now, the same applies to Mali, whose military-appointed prime minister spoke at the UN General Assembly last week. Abdoulaye Maïga praised Mali's ties with Russia while criticizing the United Nations and France.
The world will remember that after being abandoned in mid-air on 10th of June 2021 by France's unilateral decision to withdraw the Barkhane force from Mali, my country was then stabbed in the back by the French authorities.
Now, several times during his speech, Maïga referred to a French junta, and Mali has accused France of supporting terrorist groups that French and Malian security forces were supposed to be fighting against. Well, to help us make sense of this very complicated relationship, I'm joined now from Wilton Park in the UK by Alex Vines. He is the director of the Africa program at Chatham House. Alex, thanks so much for being with us. First, it's ironic, to hear a junta-appointed prime minister make reference to a French junta, but, I mean, what does that actually mean from Mali's perspective?
Look, I think the Malian junta is in trouble. It's fragmenting, and this is about trying to shore up its support, including its calculation to remove the French and replace the French with the Russians. So I think that's what's going on. I'm actually just finishing a conference discussing amongst these things Mali at Wilton Park here in the UK. And it's also striking that the Malian prime minister not only criticized the French as a junta, but he also criticized the UN Secretary General, was quite insulting about him, and he also criticized the neighboring states. So he wasn't particularly complimentary about anybody except the Russian Federation.
Right. But we have to be honest. I mean, it's not just, the military government in Mali now that's angry at France and has said to get out. Help us
Oh,
understand
no,
why the relationship has soured so badly, and is it now kind of damaged beyond repair?
you're absolutely right. France is in trouble across the Francophonie, particularly the Sahel. So that's absolutely the case. It's the way that France managed its post colonial relationships, known more widely as France Afrique. So your question, can it be repaired? Over time, yes, but I don't think France can bilaterally go back to Mali. I think, though, bilaterally, in a multilaterally through a UN mandate, for example, it might do, but not at the moment. This junta needs to pass through first. But I would predict in a few years, maybe even in a year, we'll start to see a reconfiguration again of France in places like Mali, but not on their own.
Yeah, I want you to tell us more about that relationship and how it could be rebuilt, because, like you said, Mali hasn't been the only former French colony to reject French influence. We know even Algeria's relationship with France has gone terribly wrong. They've even moved to replace the French language with English in Algerian schools. I mean, what is happening? What has France done that's made their former colonies so offended?
I think it was this France Afrique tight grip on parts of the economy, a patronizing style too. And the French are now rueing that this was their policy. There is a lot of reflection. I've been in meetings with French officials where they recognize that they have to change. So that is now beginning to happen. And France is the European country with the closest connections in the African continent. It's foreign policy priority number 2 or 3 for France. For my country, the United Kingdom, is probably about down to number 20 or 25. So that connection, those connections continue, but they're not sustainable in the way that they were in the past.
Right. How does Mali's stance, though, here fit in with, I'm going to bring up Senegal's Macky Sall. He's also the current chair of the African Union, as we know. He's saying, don't pressure Africa, EU and the West, to take sides in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Don't make us the breeding ground for your new Cold War. So, I mean, it's not just against France. There's a Western issue here now, is there not?
Yeah, I mean, I think the West shouldn't be asking for African countries to be pigeonholed and choose sides. The predominant African default position is non-alignment, which is also what we saw increasingly towards the tail end of the Cold War all those years ago. And so abstention, or not even turning up for the vote, is the more normal position for Africans. There are very few Africans that have actually voted in support of the Russian Federation. In the first UN General Assembly vote, there was just one, that was Eritrea. So I tend to think that Macky Sall is correct in this regard, that don't push Africa too hard, but so don't assume that if you're not for us, you're against us. There is a middle road.
But the interesting point in this is also, as you pointed out, that Mali in particular is really leaning toward this kind of new partnership with Russia instead. I mean, has Russia been a more productive, positive partner for Mali and others in the region?
No, I don't think so. I think that's the problem. And so this is where you are having fragmentation in the ruling junta in Mali at the moment, with a part of one faction particularly trying to talk up that it made the right choice. So we all agree there is broad anti-French sentiment and anti-Western sentiment in Mali, although anti-French is much stronger. But there is increasingly a number of question marks by the population being asked about, well, can the Russians really deliver? What Malians want is improved security. And the Russians, like the French prior to them, haven't really been able to improve that security situation for the average citizen.
Right, and I mean, in a sense, Mali's security really, it matters to everybody, because certain regions of Mali have proven a sort of breeding ground for certain terrorist groups. So what's supposed to happen now? I mean, has the UN peacekeeping mission, MINUSA, is it really just failed to the point where even cooperation with Russia at least provides something?
Well, I believe the UN operation should remain. As you say, it's a peacekeeping operation. It's not a peacemaking one. So it's not meant to be, hard, sharp sword in there. That's where originally it was the French, and that now the Russians are meant to be providing that service. I would like to see the UN withdrawal. You're absolutely right. What happens in Mali is particularly significant to us in Europe, and that would also include Turkey. So it's near abroad for us, which is actually different for the Russian Federation, which I think is just about overstretching the West in particular and distracting it. It was already about that before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it's even more so that now.
All right. Alex Vines, we're going to have to leave it there. Really, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your very valuable insights. And thanks to our viewers as well for being with us. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.